The alarm systems across Station Vex 7 screamed warnings into the cold void of space. Admiral Zreth stood frozen before his display screens, watching something that should have been impossible. A massive ship was tearing through subspace at speeds that violated every known law of physics. The Korthan Empire had ruled this sector of the galaxy for 3,000 years, and in all that time, no one had ever dared to enter their space without permission. The vessel was enormous. Zreth had commanded fleets for 40 years, had seen every type of warship in the known galaxy, but this thing made their biggest battlecruisers look like toys. The ship's hull was dark gray, covered in armor plating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange markings ran along its side, symbols in a language the station's computers could not translate. Deep inside the ship, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall man with short brown hair and calm blue eyes that missed nothing. Around him, his crew worked at their stations with focused efficiency. The bridge was surprisingly quiet for such a massive warship. Only the soft hum of computers and the occasional beep of sensors broke the silence. Lisa Hayes sat at the executive officer's station to Jake's right. She had been his second in command for 5 years, and he trusted her judgment completely. Her fingers moved quickly across her console as she monitored the ship's systems. Everything was running perfectly. The UNS Defiance was humanity's greatest achievement, and it showed in every detail. Jake turned to look at the main view screen. Stars streaked past as the ship moved through space at incredible speed. Somewhere out there, beyond the borders of Korthan territory, was the horizon's dawn. The colony ship had left Earth 6 months ago with 200 people aboard, families looking for a new home on a distant world. 3 weeks ago, they had sent a distress signal from deep inside Korthan space. Then nothing. Just silence. The United Nations Space Command had sent the Defiance to find them. Jake knew the mission was dangerous. The Korthan Empire did not welcome visitors, especially not humans. Earth had only made contact with alien species 50 years ago, and the relationship had been tense ever since. The Korthans viewed humans as primitive newcomers who did not understand the complex politics of galactic civilization. Ben Carter looked up from the weapons station. He was young, only 26, but he had proven himself during training exercises. His hands never shook, even under pressure. That was important in a weapons officer. Jake had chosen him personally for this mission. The communications officer suddenly straightened in her seat. Her name was Julie Stevens, and she had been the first to detect the Horizon's dawn distress signal weeks ago. Now her face was pale as she listened to something through her headset. She looked at Jake with worried eyes. Admiral Zreth made his decision. He could not allow this alien vessel to penetrate deeper into Korthan space. The High Council would have his head if he let it pass unchallenged. He gave the order, and 12 Korthan destroyers broke formation and moved to intercept. Each destroyer was a formidable warship, equipped with plasma cannons powerful enough to level cities. Together, they represented enough firepower to destroy a small moon. The destroyers surrounded the human ship in a perfect spherical formation. Zreth watched his tactical display with satisfaction. The alien vessel had stopped moving. Perhaps they understood the futility of resistance. Perhaps they would surrender without a fight. That would be preferable. The High Council liked to interrogate captured aliens before deciding their fate. Jake received the Korthan transmission. It was not a greeting. It was not even a warning. The message was simple and clear. Leave immediately or be destroyed. No negotiations. No diplomatic courtesy. Just a threat. Jake sighed quietly. He had hoped to avoid violence, but the Korthans were not giving him a choice. He opened a channel and transmitted humanity's response. His voice was calm and measured as he explained that they were searching for missing civilians. He requested permission to continue their search and promised to leave Korthan space as soon as the colonists were found. He emphasized that Earth wanted peace, not conflict. The response came in the form of weapons fire. All 12 Korthan destroyers opened fire at once. Brilliant streams of superheated plasma lanced through space, converging on the Defiance from every direction. The combined firepower was enough to vaporize any ship in the galaxy. Station Vex 7 watched the attack with grim satisfaction. The alien ship would be nothing but scattered atoms in seconds. The plasma impacts lit up the Defiance's shields like a miniature sun. Energy washed over the invisible barrier, creating rippling patterns of light. The bridge crew felt a slight vibration through the deck, nothing more. Lisa checked her console and reported that the shields had absorbed the attack without dropping below 98% strength. The Corthan weapons had barely scratched them. Jake stood perfectly still for a moment, processing what had just happened. The Corthans had fired first. They had attacked without provocation, without even attempting to verify his peaceful intentions. That changed everything. He turned to Ben Carter and gave a single nod. The young weapons officer understood immediately. The Defiance carried weapons that humanity had spent decades developing. While other species had stagnated with the same technology for centuries, humans had pushed forward relentlessly. They had studied physics, tested theories, and built things that should not have been possible. The railgun was one of those things. A small section of the Defiance's hull opened smoothly. Inside, a long barrel extended into space. The railgun used electromagnetic force to accelerate a solid projectile to a fraction of light speed. There was no explosion, no flash of light. The round simply left the barrel and crossed the distance to the nearest Corthan destroyer in less than a second. The destroyer never had a chance to react. The projectile hit its forward section and kept going, punching through shields, armor, and hull like they were tissue paper. It exited through the rear of the ship and continued through 2 more destroyers before its energy finally dissipated. All 3 ships went dark instantly, their systems destroyed by the kinetic impact. Aboard Station Vex 7, Admiral Zreth felt his blood turn cold. 3 destroyers gone in an instant. The other 9 were already breaking formation, their captains panicking. Some fired wildly at the human ship. Others tried to run. It made no difference. The Defiance's targeting systems tracked each one with perfect precision. Jake did not order the destruction of the remaining ships. He had made his point. Instead, he instructed Ben to disable them. One by one, the railgun fired, each shot carefully calculated to destroy engines but leave life support intact. Within 2 minutes, all 12 Corthan destroyers were drifting helplessly in space. The bridge of the Defiance was silent. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They had just fought the first battle between humanity and the Corthan Empire, and everyone understood what that meant. There would be consequences. The Corthans would not forget this humiliation. They would respond with overwhelming force. Ryan Brooks spoke from the engineering station. He was responsible for keeping the ship's systems running, and he needed Jake to know the status. The fusion drives were operating perfectly. The shields had already regenerated to full strength. The railgun could fire again immediately if necessary. The Defiance was ready for whatever came next. Jake ordered Julie to broadcast a message on all Corthan frequencies. He wanted every ship, every station, every military commander in this sector to hear what he had to say. When she confirmed the channel was open, he spoke directly to the Corthan Empire. His message was simple. Humanity had not come looking for war. They had come looking for their people. The Corthans had fired first, forcing his hand. He regretted the violence, but he would not apologize for defending his ship. The search for the Horizon's dawn would continue. Any further attacks would be met with appropriate force. He recommended they choose diplomacy over aggression. The transmission ended. Jake turned away from the view screen and looked at his crew. They were watching him, waiting for orders. These were good people, trained and dedicated. They had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might not return. Now they had just defeated 12 enemy warships without suffering any damage. Some of them looked shocked. Others looked proud. Jake told them the truth. This was just the beginning. The Corthan Empire would not accept defeat so easily. They would send more ships, bigger fleets. The Defiance would face challenges that would test every system and every crew member. But they had a job to do and they would see it through. Those missing colonists were counting on them. Lisa stood and moved to his side. She asked quietly if he really thought the Corthans would back down. Jake shook his head. No, they would not back down. They were too proud, too used to being the dominant power. But maybe, just maybe, they would think twice before attacking again. Maybe they would realize that humanity was not as primitive as they believed. The Defiance resumed its course deeper into Corthan space. Behind them, the disabled destroyers sent out distress signals. Station Vex 7 scrambled rescue ships to recover the crews. And far away in the capital system of the Corthan Empire, the High Council received word of what? The news spread through Corthan space faster than any ship could travel. Communication networks buzzed with reports of the impossible battle. A single human vessel had destroyed 12 Korthan destroyers without taking any damage. Military commanders across the Empire refused to believe it at first. The reports had to be exaggerated or completely false, but Admiral Zreth had transmitted sensor data, and the numbers did not lie. In the Grand Council chamber on the Korthan homeworld, Chancellor Vexel listened to his advisors argue about how to respond. Some wanted to negotiate, to find out what these humans wanted and why they had such advanced technology. Others demanded immediate military action. The Empire's reputation was at stake. If they did nothing, every subject species would see it as weakness. Rebellions would ignite across their territory. Chancellor Vexel made his decision quickly. Pride would not allow him to appear weak. He ordered Admiral Zreth to mobilize the Third Fleet. 200 warships would hunt down this human vessel and destroy it completely. There would be no survivors, no evidence left behind. The humans would learn that the Korthan Empire did not tolerate challenges to its authority. Aboard the Defiance, Jake studied the intelligence reports that Oracle had compiled. Oracle was the ship's artificial intelligence, a sophisticated computer system that could process information faster than any human brain. It had been analyzing Korthan communications since they entered enemy space, learning their language, decoding their military protocols, and mapping their territory. The AI had found something interesting. Multiple Korthan transmissions mentioned a mining colony on a planet called Rexus 4. The messages referenced human workers at the facility. That phrase stood out immediately. Human workers. The Korthans did not employ humans. They barely acknowledged humanity's existence. So why would humans be working at a mining colony deep in Korthan space? Lisa worked with Oracle to narrow down the search. The transmissions had originated 3 weeks ago, right around the time the Horizon's Dawn had gone silent. The location matched the colony ship's last known trajectory. It seemed too convenient to be coincidence. The missing colonist had to be on Rexus 4. Jake called a meeting of his senior staff. They gathered in the briefing room behind the bridge. Lisa was there, along with Ben Carter, Ryan Brooks, and Helen Price. Helen commanded the ship's Marine contingent, 200 soldiers trained for ground combat. She was a serious woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for getting her troops through impossible situations. Jake explained what Oracle had discovered. The pieces fit together too well to ignore. The colony ship had somehow ended up at Rexus 4, and now the colonists were being forced to work in Korthan mines. The word that kept appearing in the transmissions was slaves. The Korthans had taken the colonists as slaves. Helen asked the obvious question. If the colonists were on Rexus 4, why had the Korthans attacked the Defiance instead of negotiating? Jake had an answer for that. The Empire had something to hide. They did not want anyone to know they were enslaving humans. If word got out, it would create diplomatic problems with other species. Better to destroy the witnesses and pretend nothing had happened. Ben looked troubled. He asked if they were really going to start a war over this. Jake understood the concern. They were one ship, alone in enemy territory thousands of light years from Earth. The smart move would be to report what they had found and wait for reinforcements. But those colonists had been slaves for weeks already. Every day they waited meant more suffering. Ryan spoke up from his seat. He reminded everyone that the Defiance was built for exactly this kind of situation. The ship could outrun anything the Korthans had. Its weapons could disable entire fleets. Its shields could absorb punishment that would destroy other vessels. They had every advantage except numbers, and Jake was right. They could not abandon those people. The decision was made. They would proceed to Rexus 4, locate the colonists, and bring them home. If the Korthans tried to stop them, well, they had already seen what happened when they picked a fight with humanity. Jake dismissed his officers and returned to the bridge. The Defiance adjusted course toward the mining colony. Admiral Zreth received his orders and immediately began organizing the Third Fleet. Ships were recalled from patrol routes across the sector. Captains were briefed on their target. The human vessel was heading toward Rexus 4, which meant they had figured out where the human slaves were being kept. Zreth cursed quietly. This was exactly what the High Council had feared. The Third Fleet assembled in record time. 200 warships arranged themselves in attack formations that had been perfected over centuries of warfare. Zreth knew he was overreacting by bringing such overwhelming force, but the last battle had taught him a valuable lesson. Never underestimate an opponent, especially one with unknown capabilities. The fleet moved to intercept the human ship. Zreth planned to surround it completely, cutting off any escape route. Then they would fire everything at once. No shields could withstand the combined firepower of 200 ships. The human vessel would be vaporized before it could react. Jake watched the approaching fleet on his tactical display. Oracle had detected them hours ago, tracking their movements and predicting their strategy. The AI calculated that the Korthans would attempt an encirclement. They were thinking in traditional terms, trying to overwhelm with superior numbers. It was a reasonable strategy against conventional enemies, but the defiance was not conventional. Ryan had been working on something special in the engineering bay. He called them autonomous drones, small craft that the Defiance could deploy like missiles. Each drone carried an electromagnetic pulse weapon, designed specifically to disable Korthan shield generators. Oracle had analyzed captured sensor data from the first battle and identified a vulnerability in their defensive systems. Lisa asked how many drones they could deploy. Ryan grinned and told her they had manufactured 500 in the last 6 hours. The Defiance had industrial fabricators that could produce equipment on demand. It was technology that the Korthans had never developed because they saw no need for it. Their ships were built in orbital shipyards over decades. The idea of a ship building its own weapons during a mission would seem absurd to them. The third fleet closed in. Zreth gave the order to attack. 200 ships opened fire simultaneously. The space around the Defiance lit up with energy as plasma, missiles, and beam weapons converged on a single point. The attack was so intense that sensors on nearby planets detected the energy spike. The Defiance's shields flared brilliantly but held firm. Jake waited calmly as the barrage continued. He let the Korthans empty their first volley, let them believe they were making progress. Then he gave the order to Ben. Launch all drones. 500 small craft erupted from launch bays all over the Defiance. They scattered in every direction, each one moving at incredible speed. The Korthan ships tried to target them with point defense weapons, but there were too many moving too fast. Within seconds, the drones reached their targets. The electromagnetic pulses fired in perfect synchronization. Across the third fleet, shield generators overloaded and failed. Systems went dark as the pulses disrupted power distribution. Ships that had been firing moments ago suddenly went silent, drifting helplessly in space. Now the Defiance moved. The fusion drives pushed the massive ship forward at acceleration that should have torn it apart. But humanity had learned to manipulate gravitational fields, protecting the crew from the forces that would have killed them. The ship weaved through the disabled Korthan fleet like a dancer, impossibly agile for something so large. Ben worked his console with focused intensity. The railgun fired again and again, each shot carefully aimed. Jake had given clear instructions. Disable, do not destroy. They were not here to commit genocide. Every round hit an engine or a weapons array, leaving the Korthan ships crippled but intact. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Zreth watched his fleet fall apart. 3/4 of his ships were disabled within the first 5 minutes of engagement. The human vessel was doing exactly what it had done before, but on a much larger scale. His tactical officers were shouting reports, but Zreth barely heard them. He was watching a single ship dismantle the pride of the Korthan military, and there was nothing he could do about it. The few ships that still had power were trying to retreat. Zreth wanted to order them to regroup and counterattack, but he knew it was pointless. They were beaten. The human ship had superior technology in every category that mattered. Shields, weapons, propulsion, everything. The Korthan Empire had been the dominant power for so long that they had stopped innovating. They had believed their technology was perfect. They had been wrong. Jake ordered the ceasefire. 73 Korthan ships were disabled and drifting. The rest were fleeing as fast as their drives could carry them. He instructed Julie to transmit another message. Tell the Korthan High Council that humanity wanted peace, but would respond to aggression with overwhelming force. Tell them that the Defiance was proceeding to Rexus 4 to recover human citizens. Any attempt to interfere would have consequences. Lisa asked if he thought they would listen. Jake shrugged. Probably not. The Korthans were too proud to admit defeat. But maybe, just maybe. The planet Rexus 4 hung in space like a dark jewel. Its surface was covered in rocky mountains and deep valleys, with almost no water or vegetation. It was a harsh world, valuable only for the mineral deposits buried beneath its crust. The Korthans had been mining those minerals for 200 years, using slave labor from dozens of different species. The Defiance entered orbit without meeting any resistance. Every Korthan military ship in the system had fled the moment they received word of the Third Fleet's defeat. The mining facilities were still operational, but the administrative staff was evacuating as fast as they could pack their belongings. No one wanted to be there when the humans arrived. Jake stood on the bridge watching the planet below. Oracle had already scanned the surface and located the mining complex where the human life signs were concentrated. Deep underground, in tunnels carved through solid rock, 147 people were trapped. The exact number of passengers the Horizon's Dawn had been carrying. Helen Price arrived on the bridge wearing full combat armor. The powered suit made her look twice her normal size, with reinforced plating covering every vital area. Behind her, the rest of the Marine contingent was suiting up and checking their weapons. They had trained for planetary assault operations, but this would be their first real mission. Helen could feel the tension among her troops. They were ready but also nervous. Jake briefed Helen on the mission parameters. The mining complex had multiple entrance points, but most were too narrow for the Marines in their armor. Oracle recommended they use drop pods and land directly at the main entrance. From there, they would fight their way down to the lowest levels where the prisoners were being held. Resistance was expected to be light. Most of the Korthan guards had already fled. Helen nodded and asked about civilian casualties. Jake had already thought about that. The miners who worked voluntarily for the Korthans were not their enemy. They were just doing their jobs. Helen's orders were to avoid harming anyone who did not pose a direct threat. They were here to rescue humans, not to punish Korthans for their empire's crimes. The drop pods launched from the Defiance in groups of 10. Each pod was a small armored capsule carrying 2 Marines. They fell through the atmosphere like meteors, protected by heat shields that glowed white-hot from friction. The pods hit the ground hard, creating small craters on impact. Hatches blew open and Marines poured out, weapons ready. Helen was in the first wave. She stepped out of her pod and immediately scanned the area. The main entrance to the mining complex was 50 meters ahead, a massive steel door built into the side of a mountain. Oracle had already hacked the security systems and opened it for them. The door stood wide open, revealing a dark tunnel leading underground. The Marines moved in standard formation. Helen took point with her second-in-command, a man named Kyle Martin. Behind them, squads spread out to cover every angle. Their helmet displays showed tactical information fed directly from Oracle. The AI could see through walls using ground-penetrating radar, mapping the entire complex in real time. The tunnels were poorly lit and filled with dust. Mining equipment sat abandoned along the walls. The Marines passed storage rooms filled with supplies, worker dormitories that had been hastily evacuated, and control centers with computers still running. There was no sign of resistance. The Korthans had truly fled rather than face humanity's soldiers. They descended deeper into the complex. The tunnels got narrower and the air got hotter. At this depth, the planet's internal heat made the environment uncomfortable even inside climate-controlled armor. Helen could not imagine what it must have been like for the human slaves working down here without proper protection. Oracle directed them to a large chamber 500 meters below the surface. Sensors showed multiple human life signs inside, along with a few Korthans. Helen signaled her troops to prepare for contact. They stacked up outside the chamber entrance, checking their weapons one final time. Then she gave the order and they breached the door. The chamber was enormous, carved from solid rock and supported by metal beams. Mining equipment filled the space, giant machines designed to extract ore from the walls. And scattered throughout the chamber, dressed in ragged clothes and covered in dust, were the missing colonists. The humans looked up in shock as armed Marines poured into the chamber. Some of them screamed, thinking they were under attack. Others just stared in disbelief. They had been prisoners for weeks, forced to work in these mines under threat of violence. They had given up hope of rescue, and now here were soldiers in advanced armor, speaking English and telling them they were safe. Helen removed her helmet so they could see her face. She spoke calmly, introducing herself and explaining that they were from the UNS Defiance. Earth had sent them to bring everyone home. The colonists reacted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Some of them started crying. Others asked questions all at once, their voices overlapping in confusion. A woman pushed through the crowd. Her name was Patricia Cole, and she had been the captain of the Horizon's Dawn. She looked exhausted, her face streaked with dirt and her hair matted with sweat. But her eyes were still sharp, still focused. She asked Helen how they had found them. Helen explained briefly. The distress signal had reached Earth. The Defiance had come looking. They had fought their way through Corthan space and were here to take everyone home. Patricia nodded slowly, processing the information. Then she turned and started organizing the colonists. They needed medical attention, food, water, and transport back to the ship. She might have been a prisoner, but she was still a captain. The Corthan overseers were found hiding in a side chamber. There were 5 of them, low-level officials who had not fled with the others. Kyle and his squad secured them without violence. The Corthans surrendered immediately, knowing they had no chance against the armored Marines. Greg Foster arrived with the medical team. He was the Defiance's chief medical officer, a skilled doctor who had treated everything from combat injuries to alien diseases. He set up a triage station in the chamber and started examining the colonists. Many were malnourished and dehydrated. Some had injuries from working with dangerous equipment. A few showed signs of illness from breathing contaminated air. Jake descended to the surface in a shuttle. He wanted to see the colonists himself, to assure them personally that they were safe. When he walked into the chamber still wearing his uniform, the colonists recognized him immediately. Some of them had seen him on news broadcasts before they left Earth. Captain Jake Morrison, the man who had commanded humanity's first deep space missions. He moved among them, shaking hands and listening to their stories. They told him about the last weeks, about being captured when the Horizon's Dawn was ambushed, about being forced to work in the mines with minimal food and water. They told him about colonists who had died from exhaustion or accidents. Patricia gave him exact numbers. 14 people had died since they were captured. 147 survived. Jake felt anger burning in his chest, but he kept his expression calm. These people needed reassurance, not rage. He promised them that no one would hurt them again. He promised that the Corthans would answer for what they had done. And he promised to get them home safely, no matter what it took. The evacuation took 6 hours. The Marines established a secure perimeter, while shuttles ferried colonists from the surface to the Defiance. Greg and his medical team worked continuously, treating injuries and monitoring vital signs. Some colonists were too weak to walk and had to be carried on stretchers. Jake personally questioned one of the captured Corthan overseers. The alien was terrified, stammering answers to every question. He confirmed what Jake had suspected. The Corthan Empire regularly enslaved weaker species. It was common practice, sanctioned by the government. The Empire's economy depended on slave labor. Hundreds of worlds, thousands of mines and factories, all operated by prisoners who had no rights and no hope of freedom. Jake had Oracle record every word. This testimony would be broadcast across the galaxy. Everyone would know what the Corthan Empire really was. The consequences would be devastating for their reputation, but Jake did not care. The truth needed to be told. The last shuttle lifted off just as the sun was setting on Rex's 4. Helen and her Marines were the last to leave, making sure every colonist was safe before abandoning the planet. As they flew back to the Defiance, Helen looked down at the mining complex. Somewhere in those tunnels were the graves of 14 humans who had not survived. She made a silent promise that their deaths would not be forgotten. Back aboard the Defiance, the medical bay was crowded with patients. Greg and his staff worked around the clock, treating malnutrition, dehydration, and various injuries. Most of the colonists would make a full recovery with proper care. A few had suffered permanent damage from their captivity, injuries or illnesses that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Patricia stood on the bridge with Jake, watching as the Defiance prepared to leave orbit. She thanked him quietly for coming after them. She had lost hope after the first week of captivity. The Corthans had told them no one was coming, that Earth did not even know they were missing. She had started to believe it. The footage spread across the galaxy like a virus. Every species with access to communication networks saw the same images. Human slaves working in Corthan mines, testimony from Corthan officials admitting to empire-wide slavery, evidence of systematic abuse spanning centuries. The Korthan Empire tried desperately to suppress the broadcasts, but it was too late. Humanity had hacked into their networks at every level. The truth was out. Rebellions ignited on 12 worlds within 3 days. Species that had been enslaved for generations suddenly saw hope for freedom. On some planets, the uprisings were peaceful protests. On others, violence erupted as slaves turned on their masters. The Korthan military scrambled to respond, but they were stretched thin. They could not be everywhere at once. Chancellor Vexil sat in his private chambers staring at reports from across the Empire. His advisors had spent days arguing about how to respond. The military commanders wanted to crush the rebellions with overwhelming force, make examples of the rebels to discourage others from joining them. But Vexil knew that strategy would only make things worse. Every act of brutality would be recorded and broadcast, further damaging the Empire's reputation. The diplomatic corps suggested reaching out to other galactic powers for support. Surely the Yulani Concordat or the Threxian Alliance would help maintain order. But those civilizations had sent cold replies. They had seen the footage too. They knew what the Korthan Empire really was. Some of them had suspected for years but had no proof. Now they wanted nothing to do with defending slavery. Jake returned to human space as a hero. The Defiance entered Earth orbit to a celebration unlike anything in recent history. The rescued colonists were reunited with their families. News networks ran stories about the daring rescue around the clock. Jake gave a brief press conference, deflecting praise to his crew and emphasizing that they had only done their duty. But behind the celebrations, serious discussions were taking place. The United Nations Space Command convened an emergency session. Jake was called to testify before the council, explaining everything that had happened. He spoke for 3 hours, detailing every encounter with Korthan forces, every tactical decision, every piece of evidence they had gathered about the slave trade. The council debated their response for 2 full days. Some members argued for immediate military action. The Korthan Empire was vulnerable. They could be defeated and dismantled before they recovered. Others counseled caution. Yes, the Defiance had defeated Korthan forces, but that was one ship against small fleets. A full-scale war would be different. Humanity might win, but at what cost? Admiral Nathan Perry spoke on the 3rd day. He was the highest-ranking officer in the Space Command, a veteran of first contact situations. He reminded the council that humanity had always valued freedom above all else. They had fought wars on Earth to end slavery. They had written it into their founding documents that all people deserved liberty. Now they had proof that slavery existed on a galactic scale. They could not ignore it. They could not stand by and do nothing. The council voted. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would intervene, but they would try diplomacy first. Jake was promoted to Commodore and given authority to negotiate with the Korthan Empire. He would lead a delegation to neutral territory and present humanity's demands. If the Korthans refused, well, Earth was already building more dreadnoughts. The construction yards around Earth and Mars worked at maximum capacity. 12 new dreadnoughts were already taking shape. Massive vessels designed on the same principles as the Defiance, but incorporating improvements based on combat data. Hundreds of smaller warships were being built as escorts. Earth was preparing for war while hoping for peace. The negotiations were held at a space station operated by the Yulani Concordat. The Yulani were an ancient species, older than the Korthans with a reputation for fairness. They had agreed to host the talks and provide security. Their station was in neutral space, roughly halfway between Earth and the Korthan homeworld. Jake arrived aboard a diplomatic shuttle with a small delegation. Claire Newton was there, a woman in her 50s with decades of diplomatic experience. She had handled first contact with 3 different species and was considered one of humanity's best negotiators. Also present were military advisors, legal experts, and translators, though Oracle could handle most translation duties. The Korthan delegation was larger and more ornate. Chancellor Vexil himself had come, a sign of how seriously they took the negotiations. He was surrounded by advisors, all wearing elaborate robes that signified their rank and status. They moved with the confidence of people who had ruled the galaxy for millennia. Though Jake noticed hints of nervousness beneath the facade. The first meeting took place in a conference room, designed to accommodate multiple species. The chairs adjusted automatically to fit different body types. The temperature and atmosphere could be customized for each section of the room. The Yulani host sat at the head of the table, observing but not participating. Chancellor Vexil opened with a prepared speech about the long history of the Korthan Empire, their contributions to galactic civilization, and their willingness to discuss misunderstandings with the humans. His tone was condescending, the voice of a parent addressing a difficult child. Jake listened politely, showing no emotion. When the Chancellor finished, Claire responded. She thanked the Yulani for hosting and acknowledged the Korthan delegation's presence. Then she got straight to the point. Humanity had evidence of systematic slavery throughout the Korthan Empire. They had testimony from Korthan officials. They had rescued human slaves and documented their treatment. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a crime against sentient beings. The room went quiet. Vexil's advisors looked shocked that anyone would speak so bluntly. The Chancellor himself remained calm, though his eyes narrowed slightly. He replied that the Empire's labor practices were internal matters. Other species had no right to interfere. Besides, the workers were treated well. They received food and shelter in exchange for their labor. Jake spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried clearly across the room. He described what he had seen in the mines on Rexus 4, the malnourished colonists, the dangerous working conditions, the lack of medical care. 14 people had died. He asked the Chancellor if that was what he considered treating workers well. Vexil did not answer directly. Instead, he changed tactics. He pointed out that war between their civilizations would be devastating. Surely the humans did not want to be responsible for billions of deaths. Could they not find a compromise? Perhaps the Empire could improve working conditions. Perhaps they could discuss payment for labor. Claire shook her head. There would be no compromise on slavery. Humanity's position was clear. All enslaved populations would be freed immediately. The Korthan Empire would pay reparations to the species they had wronged. They would allow independent observers to verify compliance, and they would guarantee there would be no retaliation against freed slaves or rebellious worlds. The Chancellor and his advisors argued for hours. They offered concessions, tried to negotiate terms, suggested alternatives. But the human delegation would not budge. Freedom was not negotiable. Claire repeated humanity's demands again and again, refusing to accept anything less. Finally, Vexil asked what would happen if the Empire refused. Jake stood and walked to the large window overlooking space. He pointed to a distant star system. That was where Earth's shipyards were. Right now, 12 new dreadnoughts were under construction. Within 6 months, humanity would have a fleet capable of challenging any military force in the galaxy. He turned back to face the Korthans. If the Empire refused to reform peacefully, humanity would dismantle it by force. They would liberate every slave world. They would destroy every military installation that resisted. They would not stop until the Korthan Empire no longer existed. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The Chancellor looked into Jake's eyes and saw something that disturbed him. Absolute conviction. These humans meant every word. They were not bluffing. They were not posturing. They would actually do it. They would start a war that could consume the galaxy, and they would not back down. Vexil requested a recess. The Korthan delegation withdrew to private chambers to discuss their options. Jake and Claire waited patiently. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the Korthans to decide between peace and destruction. 3 hours later, the delegations reconvened. Chancellor Vexil looked older somehow, as if the weight of centuries had finally caught up with him. He announced that the Korthan Empire would accept humanity's terms. It would take time to implement all the changes, but the process would begin immediately. All slaves would be freed. Reparations would be negotiated with affected species. Independent observers would be allowed to verify compliance. Claire asked for one more guarantee. The Korthans would have to acknowledge publicly that slavery was wrong. They would have to admit their crimes and apologize to the species they had harmed. It was about more than just freeing slaves. It was about changing the culture that had allowed slavery to exist for so long. The Chancellor hesitated. That was harder than any military defeat. It meant admitting that the Empire had been wrong for 3,000. 6 months after the agreement was signed, the galaxy looked very different. The Korthan Empire began releasing enslaved populations as promised, though the process was slow and complicated. Centuries of oppression could not be undone overnight. Some freed slaves had nowhere to go. Their homeworlds destroyed generations ago. Others returned to find their civilizations had been devastated by Korthan occupation. Humanity took an active role in managing the transition. Claire Newton established the Coalition for Free Species, an alliance dedicated to helping newly liberated worlds rebuild. Earth provided resources, technology, and expertise. But more importantly, they provided protection. The 12 new dreadnoughts that had been under construction were now operational, patrolling Coalition space and ensuring that no one would prey on vulnerable species again. Jake commanded the Coalition fleet from the bridge of the Defiance. His ship had become a symbol recognized across the galaxy. When it appeared in orbit around a world, everyone knew what it meant. Humanity was watching. Freedom would be protected. The Age of Empires built on slavery was ending. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Within the Corthan Empire, resistance movements formed among military officers and nobles who had profited from the old system. They saw the reforms as humiliation, a betrayal of everything the Empire had stood for. Several attempted coups were put down by loyalist forces, but the internal tensions remained. Chancellor Vexil struggled to hold the Empire together. He had been raised to believe in Corthan superiority, taught that other species existed to serve. Now he was dismantling the system that had made his civilization powerful. It went against every instinct. But when he looked at reports from the border worlds, when he saw images of the human dreadnoughts, he remembered that the alternative was extinction. The Coalition grew quickly. Freed species joined eagerly, grateful for protection and assistance. The Yulani Concordat became a member after careful consideration, seeing the Coalition as a counterbalance to Corthan power. Even some Corthan worlds joined, border colonies that had always resented the Empire's authoritarian rule. Lisa Hayes had been promoted to captain and given command of the UNS Horizon, one of the new dreadnoughts. She patrolled the frontier between Coalition and Corthan space, responding to distress calls and mediating disputes. Her ship intercepted slavers on 3 occasions, pirates who thought they could continue the old trade in secret. Each time she disabled their vessels and freed the captives. Word spread quickly. Slavery was no longer profitable when it meant facing human warships. Ryan Brooks led the engineering division that shared human technology with Coalition members. Not everything, of course. Some innovations were kept secret for security reasons. But fusion drives, advanced medical equipment, and agricultural technology were freely distributed. Ryan believed that raising the standard of living across the Coalition would prevent future conflicts. Desperate people turned to violence. Prosperous people chose peace. Helen Price trained mixed-species marine units. Teaching aliens human tactics was challenging. Different species had different strengths and limitations. But Helen found that the fundamentals of small unit tactics translated well across cultures. Cover and movement were universal concepts. Fire discipline worked the same regardless of what species pulled the trigger. Her graduates became elite forces, respected throughout the Coalition military. On Earth, people followed the developments with intense interest. For the first time in history, humanity was a major power on the galactic stage. Some worried that Earth was taking on too much responsibility. The Coalition required constant attention, resources, and military presence. But polls showed strong support for the intervention. People remembered what slavery had been like on Earth. They would not stand by while it continued among the stars. Jake visited Earth twice during those 6 months. The first trip was to testify before the Space Command Council about Coalition operations. He reported steady progress. More worlds joining every month. Infrastructure improving. Trade networks developing. The second visit was personal. He attended a memorial service for the 14 colonists who had died on Rexus 4. Their families thanked him for bringing the survivors home. He told them their loved ones had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had exposed a great evil and started a movement that was changing the galaxy. The Corthan military began adapting to the new reality. Admiral Zreth, who had commanded the Third Fleet during its defeat, became an unexpected advocate for reform. He argued that the Empire's military had grown stagnant, relying on superior numbers instead of innovation. The humans had shown what was possible when a civilization pushed the boundaries of technology. If the Corthan Empire wanted to survive, it needed to learn from them. Zreth proposed a joint training program between Corthan and Coalition forces. The idea was controversial, but Chancellor Vexil supported it. Military cooperation could build trust and reduce tensions. Jake agreed to participate, sending instructors to work with Corthan officers. The first exercises were awkward. Centuries of enmity could not be forgotten overnight. But gradually, professionals from both sides found common ground. Greg Foster established medical clinics on 6 liberated worlds. The conditions he found were often terrible. Populations that had been enslaved for generations suffered from malnutrition, disease, and untreated injuries. His team worked around the clock, training local doctors and distributing medical supplies. On one world, they stopped an epidemic that would have killed thousands. On another, they set up the first proper hospital the planet had seen in 2 centuries. Not every intervention went smoothly. On a world called Thex 9, humans arrived to find 2 rival factions fighting a civil war. Both had been enslaved by the Korthans, but they blamed each other for collaborating with their oppressors. Jake sent peacekeepers, but the situation was complicated. Neither side trusted outsiders. Eventually, Claire negotiated a ceasefire and began the slow process of reconciliation. It would take years, maybe generations, but at least the killing had stopped. The Korthan Empire officially joined the coalition in the 7th month. The announcement shocked many. How could the former oppressors join an alliance dedicated to freedom? But Chancellor Vexil explained his reasoning. The Empire had a choice. It could cling to the past and eventually be destroyed, or it could reform and be part of building a better future. He chose reform. The decision split the Empire. Several provinces refused to accept it and declared independence. They would maintain the old ways, they said. Keep slaves, rule with strength, uphold tradition. Jake knew those breakaway regions would cause problems. But for now, the focus was on consolidating the coalition and helping the majority of Korthan space that wanted to change. Ben Carter became Jake's tactical advisor. The young weapons officer had proven himself during multiple engagements. He had a gift for analyzing enemy capabilities and finding vulnerabilities. Jake relied on his assessments when planning coalition fleet deployments. Ben predicted that the breakaway Korthan provinces would try to form alliances with other authoritarian powers. He was proven right within weeks. The coalition faced its first major external threat in the 9th month. A species called the Drex, who controlled territory beyond Korthan space, saw the chaos as an opportunity. They had their own empire built on conquest and exploitation. They did not like what humanity was doing. If the coalition succeeded in ending slavery, the Drex might be next. They decided to strike first. A Drex fleet attacked a coalition border world without warning. The assault was brutal. Orbital bombardment destroyed cities and killed millions. By the time coalition ships arrived, the damage was done. Jake studied the attack and recognized it for what it was. A message. The Drex were saying they would not accept human interference in galactic affairs. Jake called an emergency meeting of coalition leadership. They had to decide how to respond. Some members argued for caution. The Drex Empire was even larger than the Korthan had been. A war with them would be devastating. Others demanded immediate retaliation. The attack could not go unanswered. If they appeared weak, other powers would test them. Claire suggested a third option. Show strength but offer diplomacy. Send a large fleet to Drex borders as a demonstration. Make it clear that aggression had consequences, but also open communication channels. Give them a chance to back down before starting a war that would cost billions of lives. Jake agreed. He assembled a fleet of 8 Dreadnoughts, the largest human formation ever deployed. They moved to the Drex border and waited. The message was clear without words. This is what you will face if you continue. The Drex watched the human ships with their advanced technology and overwhelming firepower. They remembered what happened to the Korthan Third Fleet. The Drex leadership contacted the coalition 3 days later. They wanted to talk. Claire led the negotiations with Jake present as a reminder of military capability. The Drex tried to justify their attack. The coalition had no right to interfere in how other civilizations governed themselves. Claire responded that genocide and slavery were not internal matters. They were crimes that affected all sentient beings. The talks were difficult. The Drex were proud and aggressive by nature,